Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. As you know, these are programs that we've been running throughout the lockdown, basically trying to help people through what have been very traumatic circumstances, both with regard to the medical, legal, and economic implications of an unprecedented situation, a situation that hasn't occurred for 100 years. And today, I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Steyn from Meridian Economics, a distinguished economist, who as well has been involved in a range of what I think are extremely interesting proposals with regard to green energy and to the insurance and the capacitation of our society to have an adequate electrical supply. It's not the only thing I'm going to ask him about, but I want to start there. Prithvi, you've been working for some time with regard to alternative sources of energy, or might I put it bluntly, to shift the burden away from our coal-orientated electricity supply to something greener and something more sustainable. And I just wonder if you could, whilst I know about it, I don't know if everybody listening to this does.
Yes. Yes, Dennis, it's a pleasure to be talking to you this afternoon. Yes, there are many reasons why we need to shift our energy economy, and particularly our electricity economy, away from a huge dependence on coal to cleaner energy. And primarily the reasons are environmental, both local air quality concerns and also a huge concern around climate change. But now also just purely economics. We need to follow a least costs path for our power sector, and we need to contain the costs for our electricity system, and that is also the cheapest way of doing it.
So let me ask you bluntly, how can we afford this in circumstances whereby our GDP has declined? Well, I know it's not 50%, but I mean, over the year, if we smooth this out, probably 7-8%, but it's a massive hit.
Yeah.
How is it possible for us at this gloomy, awful period, and people listening to this feeling as gloomy as I do, how are we going to do this? How would we shift our focus?
Yes, that's a very important question. And it's also worth just almost asking the converse, how can we afford not to do it?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, yeah.
So, but let me try and give it a shot. So I think the first immediate concern, as we all know, is that we have load shedding. And I think it is now becoming, and that we need to take very urgent steps to stop the need to have load shedding, because that is one of the biggest constraints on the economy recovering and on containing that reduction in GDP output that you've just referred to earlier on, and to get us back up and running again. I think it's now becoming increasingly clear that this quickest way to reduce load shedding is to immediately get more energy and capacity onto the grid. And I think the penny is also beginning to drop at Eskom and at other places, that it is not going to be viable to just rely on Eskom's potential capacity to fix the old power stations and to think that is going to be good enough to resolve load shedding. That's just not going to happen. To some extent, they can fix the plant, but many of those stations are in a terrible state, and that will not be enough. We need more capacity on the grid, and urgently so. And the only real way of doing that is that we need to open up all the possible opportunities that we have for as many parties as possible to construct new power capacity. We don't have time for long procurement strategies and any of that. So I think, it just turns out to be the case that the cheapest and quickest way of getting capacity onto the system is to build renewable energy, both large-scale projects and smaller-scale projects. And to allow the market to finance those projects, to allow off-takers that want to take power to do so, to allow Eskom to procure the power as quickly as they can, etc. So this is the line of thinking that we are going to have to follow if we want to reduce load shedding as quickly as possible. There really is no other alternative.
Bluntly put, let's just start. You've said a lot, and I'd like to unpack it, if I may, with you. I mean, the first position is, I mean, you're a serious economist. There's no way we're going to get out an 8% hole. I mean, if I take, we can call it, it doesn't matter. If we're going to carry on with the load shedding business. I mean, we can't have business as usual. I mean, that must be the case.
Yes.
I mean, it's a joke to think that we could even begin to think about economic restructuring unless we deal with it. So the question I suppose I have for you is, how long would it take, for example, to create the sort of supplementation through the sources you're talking about, to get us to a position whereby next year or the year after, wherever it is, we can start looking at a situation where we actually are growing and we can actually supply the country with sufficient electricity for that growth? I mean, what time spans are we talking about here?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are, of course, a range, as I said earlier on, there's a range of projects and investments that are necessary. Some of them will be smaller scale, like rooftop solar or agricultural solar, or in commercial and industrial sites, and then others would be larger utility scale projects. Actually, many of those projects are already at an advanced stage of development and are kind of stalled because our government has not run a procurement for large-scale utility projects for a long time now, for about 5 years.
So, sorry, can I just stop you? Can I just stop you there? Are you saying until 5 years ago, we were on track to do something?
Yes, I mean, the last time we ran a proper REAP procurement program, yeah, it was at least about 5 years ago. They're currently still building around 4. And even the finalization of that procurement, as we all know, was stalled at the end of the Zuma years. Yeah. And one of the first things that that President Ramaphosa did when he came into power was to at least get that round finalized. But we haven't actually run a procurement round since then, even though we've got load shedding. It's an astonishing situation.
So are you, sorry, let me get this right. I mean, forgive my sharp intake of breath. Can I just ask you, are you saying, here we are, we all know from what you tell me, and that must be so, that these old Eskom power stations are creaking at the seams and are not going to be able to give us a reliable sense. And we're living with load shedding. Of course, it's all very well for some of us, you know, in the middle class areas, perhaps get an inverter, or maybe in houses, blocks of apartments with a generator. But for the vast majority of people, and much more important than that, for almost all of business, the whole thing is really being run on a shoestring, because you can't reliably predict anything. I mean, one of the most interesting things for me is we can't, even with hearings, we've got to worry about the fact whether in fact there's going to be load shedding. So can we continue with Zoom, or can we continue with Teams? So the question, are you telling me that notwithstanding all of that, although this particular matter must be known to anybody with half a brain that we're actually in serious trouble, nothing has been done with regard to procurement of alternative supply?
No, I won't say nothing has been done. So we know that, you know, we have a very long-winded bureaucratic way of procuring power for the public system in this country, which I won't bore you with many of the details. But essentially, you need the minister. You need first you need the integrated resource plan to be finalized, which we did finally after 10 years last year, which should really be done every 2 years or so. Finally, we managed to do that last year, and then the minister has to look at this, and then he has to make a draft determination of how much power needs to be procured by the public sector. Then NERSA has to concur to this, etc. And that process it's completely dysfunctional. It's taken, here we are, the RRP came out almost exactly a year ago now, if I remember correctly, and it's a year later, and we haven't actually procured any power. So what they have done, the minister has done 2 determinations. We just heard this week that the second of those have now also been acceded to by NERSA. And so those preliminary bureaucratic steps have been taken, but the actual power has not been procured yet.
Could I ask you this? I mean, yeah, sorry, Kruger, to interrupt. This medium is often difficult to know when to. Can I just ask you on that? I mean, people listening to you would be saying, Well, who do we go and, whose bum do we kick, as it were, to ensure that in fact the necessary is done so that procurement takes place? If the minister, and I take it's the Minister of Energy, therefore, has done the necessary, is the ball out of his court now? Is it somebody else or some other body that has got to ensure that the procurement actually is implemented?
Yes, I mean that's an important question, but and I mean in some ways all of this falls under the Department of Energy, well, Minerals and Energy, Department of Mineral Affairs and Energy. So mineral resources and energy, but so for instance the determinations is done by the minister. The integrated resource plan on which that depends is done by the department. And NERSA itself, the energy regulator, technically falls under the department, or in its sphere. And of course, the procurement process should be run by the IPP office, which is now essentially also falls under the department. So I guess the policy responsibility and the I guess political accountability is all in that area. Yeah.
So bluntly put, if we had if, for example, the department was listening to you now and we had a whole bunch of people who said, dead right, presumably they could do this quite quickly.
Yes, I think in my mind it's pretty clear I mean, look, when it came to the COVID crisis, we declared what was it called? The state of
disaster.
State of disaster. And that allowed us to take certain steps and act quickly. But somehow, our economy is also in a state of disaster. And other than the lockdown, the second biggest cause of that is probably our energy shortage. And somehow we don't treat it the same way. Somehow we are not falling over our feet to harness all the resources and all the players in the economy that could actually contribute to solving this problem. And to come back to your previous question, Dennis, about what could be done quickly. In addition to these large-scale projects, there's also the possibility of allowing much greater role for self-supply, for smaller-scale projects, embedded generation, even for trading, third-party supply between individuals or firms on the grid. And to come also to also think about your other question about why this is taking so long. Well, we still have this very archaic system that even smaller projects. I mean, if you want to build anything bigger than 1 megawatt, now 1 megawatt is maybe a large shopping mall roof or so forth. If you want to build a project bigger than that, you need a license from NERSA. That is currently how the legal framework works. The minister has the power to exempt any particular level of project from that requirement, but currently it's very low. It's at 1 megawatt, and that means that even small projects like that have to go through the same laborious licensing process that somebody who wants to build a 150 megawatt or a 5,000 megawatt project has to go through. And that's prohibitive. But those projects, those smaller projects, 5 megawatts, 10 megawatts, 20 megawatts, are the ones that can come online in less than a year if we allow them to. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is the function? Why on earth do we require those projects to be licensed? Why do we have to have a license to do that? There's no economic term. Where I sit, there's no reason why that requirement is there. It's essentially there to restrict market access. And it's a legacy left over from the days when Eskom's monopoly has to be protected. But our policy has changed. The president has made it very clear in many speeches that we need more competition in the sector. This is also the quickest way to resolve our power shortages. But we still insist on licensing projects above 1 megawatt. And all the minister has to do is to just publish a regulation in terms of the Act that exempts smaller projects from having to have a license. It's very easy to do. And it should be, that limit should be much higher. It should be somewhere around 40 or 50 megawatts. Because why should we restrict market access?
So guide me here, assuming that you were the minister and you did this. You said, I'm going to push ahead with these smaller projects. would that have a very big, would it have, I take it, a relatively immediate effect, and would it help us through, as it were, this initial stage, so that load shedding would be reduced quite significantly in a relatively short space of time?
That is definitely, particularly if you lift that limit a bit higher, is definitely the fastest, with no doubt, the quickest way of getting more energy and capacity onto the grid. So that's the best.
How long would that take?
We'll definitely increase the number of projects coming onto the grid within a year. The ramp up, and it will continue ramping up after that, well, depending on how investor friendly you want to make your system.
If you and I had another interview, say in a year's time,
yeah,
in fact, I might, if I'm still doing this, call you back before then, but be that as it may, in a year's time, are you saying that if the plan was on tone, load shedding, if not a thing of the past, would be a lot less frequent than it is today?
I think it will. We need that trend to continue for a bit longer than 1 year to reach a stage where it really makes a significant difference. But the thing is, you have to start and get it going, because if you don't, it's not ever. So,
exactly. On the 11th of September 2020, neither you nor I, presumably, and you the expert, I'm not, would be able to predict anything in relation to this, because nothing's happened.
Yes, exactly. And you know, Dennis, this will make an enormous difference in confidence, business confidence. If we take some serious steps to allow broad-based investments, private sector investment, we take away all these nonsensical regulatory barriers. The signal that we're sending to the market in general, to the economy in general, is that this government is serious about solving our energy problems. And if you do that, along with accelerating the large utility scale procurements, with unbundling Eskom to set the plan up properly for more competition on the system, etc. Those are the kind of things we need to restore investment in the economy and build confidence.
And if I could ask you on that, how do you then respond to the sort of anti-green lobby? It says this is an unreliable source. I mean, you've heard this stuff. I mean, what's the response to that?
Well, the first thing I would say to them, Dennis, is I must look out the window, or don't even bother to look out the window. Just try and turn on your light.
Yeah.
So to be a bit more serious, I think we have constructed a false counterfactual. We somehow say to ourselves, there's this wonderful mythical world out there where a coal system gives us reliable power, but actually history shows the opposite. Empirical reality does not support that assumption. So we had massive load shedding in the 80s with Eskom for the pretty much similar reasons we have them today. And the minute the coal-based power system has to run at its designed capacity, you start having load shedding. It's only when you have surplus capacity like we had in the 90s, where it's very easy to maintain the plant because they're not actually being used a lot of the time, where you can say you're keeping the lights on all the time. So this is not trying to blame anybody or Eskom or anybody like that. It's just an inherent part of the nature of that technology. Is putting all of your eggs in a very small number of baskets is just a very bad strategy. We have a small number of very large coal-fired power stations. It's a much better system to have a very diverse portfolio of projects spread out across the length and the breadth of the country, relying on renewable sources, wind, sun, etc., hydro pump storage, some coal capacity, some gas turbine peakers, etc. And then you can, we work on sophisticated modeling projects with the CSIR, where you can construct such scenarios, those same kind of scenarios that the IRP is based on. And when you do that, you specify that the model must produce a scenario that is where there will be no load shedding. And even if it builds enough capacity and backup capacity to ensure that, it is predominantly reliant on renewable energy. And the reason is because it's cheap. So that is my answer to those lobbies, is we need a more reliable system, we need to stop load shedding, and we need the cheapest system, and we need the cleanest system. And all of those point in the same direction.
Could I ask you, as a result of COVID-19, which is, if we could lift our gaze, or at least mine, somewhat to look at, the fact that given the pandemic, it has also caused, I think, a lot of sensible people to look at climate change in a slightly fresh way, thank goodness. And I was wondering, in the light of that breeze that's now blowing through the world in relation to climate change, or at least parts of the world, I accept it doesn't take place with Mr. Trump's America. The question I wanted to ask was, would that allow us access to better funding to fund green energy? Would
Yes,
there be
that's
national institutions, or as it were, to fund us or help fund us at a relative rate, which may be accessible to us, and particularly given our parlous situation where access to capital is going to be problematic?
Yeah. So, I think that this is a really important, and maybe if I just take a step back, as you did as well, and say that, when the world is now talking about the post-COVID recovery, in many parts of the world, they are well aware that the next crisis to hit us is the climate crisis. And it's actually already reaching us. As we speak, the whole west coast of the US is burning in California. And there's a huge emphasis now on the reconstruction of economies in the post-COVID era, and the stimulus being provided to the two economies should be green, so that when we set our economic growth up and running again, that it should be a green and environmentally sustainable path because of this climate crisis that we're in. So it is also going to be true that financial markets will adjust to these new realities, that development finance will adjust and has already adjusted to these new objectives. So, from where we sit in South Africa, we've already just taken out our first IMF loan. We are going to have to talk to development finance institutions to support our infrastructure rollout. We have the huge hangover of the Eskom stranded debt that we have to resolve. And we are not going to have a very strong case if we go to them and say, well, we've got all this stranded debt in Eskom because we overspent on our coal-fired power stations, please help us. That's not a good story to tell. But if you go to them and you say to them, actually, it turns out that we've got one of the best renewable energy resources in the world. We are in desperate need of stimulating an enormous green industrialization program in our economy to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. And it also so turns out that will be a cheaper path for us to take than just continuing fixing up our old coal plants. This is the new business model that we want to follow in our power sector and our energy sector, and more broadly in our industrialization strategy, our industrial policy for our country. Would you be prepared to support us with that objective if we can commit to, in the process, deliver additional carbon savings, which would not otherwise have happened? Now, that's a very different story. And our capacity to deliver CO2 savings over and above our current IRP scenario is actually enormous, to such an extent that it will attract international attention if we put that on the table. And it's that opportunity that we should exploit to attract cheap finance for our energy sector, and also, in a sense, to become an organizing principle around which we commit ourselves to this accelerated transition in our energy sector, and create all the huge opportunities that brings for us.
How many jobs could we create if we moved in this direction that you're advocating? I know it broad park.
Yes. So to give you an idea, there's a study published on our website, which we did with the CSIR, where we looked at a scenario where we would accelerate the renewables program over a bit faster than what is envisaged in the IRP 2019, up to a point where we actually build a significant amount of renewables, about 5,000 to 6,000 megawatts a year, almost indefinitely. And sorry, let me say the first exciting thing about that work is we've shown that doesn't cost anything more, and that it most likely will be cheaper than the current plans. That is very exciting. Secondly, if you just look at very narrowly, just at the jobs in construction, which will be, remember, that will be ongoing. It'll be an indefinite construction program. So they're not temporary jobs. In construction and in operations and maintenance, within 10 years, you will create the equivalent of another Eskom in jobs, just You know,
Wow.
and you start right now. So in less than 10 years, actually, you'll be in about 7 or 8 years, you'll have created another 45,000 jobs. And that's
Wow.
just a narrow focus. Now, if you think about, if you create certainty of that build program, the enormous opportunities there are to localize most of the value chains of wind energy, solar energy, battery storage, etc. So now you are multiplying those job opportunities higher up in the value stream. And of course, what you're also doing is you're providing security of supply. So now there's more confidence in the economy. You have downstream, you're containing costs in the power sector. You stimulate reinvestment throughout the economy. I mean, it's just a very positive, virtuous circle. Yeah.
And can I ask you, what would happen if we shifted to a larger degree to where you're going with, I mean, obviously what has created anxiety, I suspect for the minister, particularly from where he comes, and the unions, is the job losses in the coal industry.
Yes, that's a very important concern. And I think it's useful to perhaps distinguish between two separate aspects there. There's the there's the kind of employment and community issues in the coal industry. And then, of course, there's also capital that is still involved in coal and how their interests are affected. And we should consider both of those. You would have heard the term just transition being used in recent times. And I think that is usually important for us to keep that objective in mind, is that it's simply not for us to coal communities and literal towns like in Drina, for instance, around in Drina power station, etc. Towns that have grown up around power stations and mines that are actually already facing severe hardship because many of those older stations are already not running that often or are partly shut down, etc. So we have not only do we have a political imperative, of course, but we have a moral obligation to support those communities that have helped give us power for so many years. But the exciting thing is that there are just endless opportunities to do so. Eskom is currently running a very interesting process where they're asking for proposals to repurpose some of those older power stations and completely open to proposals from the market. And that could involve building renewable energy projects around those stations, making use of the existing grid infrastructure, or other forms of repurposing that might not even involve energy, but uses the infrastructure there, etc. So, you know, those kind of initiatives are going to be really important. We will also need more social investment around retraining, etc. So, I mean, that will be important, and we need ways to fund that. And the kind of climate finance opportunities I was speaking about earlier on could potentially assist with some of that. So I think that is one, but ultimately we should be very clear that the green transition that we're talking about here will create many more job opportunities than we currently have, because coal mining is actually a very capital intensive business, and so is running large scale power stations. So we actually are going to be in a net better position. It's just that we need to support the communities that will be affected by this transition.
Can I, sorry, did I interrupt you? Were you going to say something?
No, that's good. You can go.
I was going to ask you, are you then encouraged that Mr. De Ruyter, the CEO of Eskom, has been making sounds or signals that he's not, let me put it positively, that he's broadly in agreement with what you're talking about?
Yes, I am very encouraged by that. I think, you know, if one works in this area for a little while, it's not that hard to see the writing on the wall. And if you're walking into a situation at Eskom where the company is essentially in a huge crisis, and if the penny starts dropping, that you're not necessarily going to solve load shedding just by fixing old power stations, that you need to do more, then I think it's probably only prudent for him to start thinking about how he's going to do that. Because ultimately, you know, if you just keep on doing the same thing and think the outcome is going to change, that's not a good idea. So I think he needs to, you know, Eskom is responsible for keeping the lights on, and the old strategies has not succeeded. So I think what he seems to be trying to explore new opportunities, and that seems to be a very sensible approach.
So I'm coming to the end of our interview, Kruger, and I wanted just to switch tack for a moment, because you know you're an economist, and and we've spoken a lot about this because I know you're an expert on it, but I just was wondering, given the crisis that we're in economically, and I mean the news, whether we discount the 50% to smooth it out to 7 or 8 over the year, whilst against all the odds, it seems to me we've done very well medically. We haven't done so economically, as you rightly say. We declare a state of disaster. What else other than, let's say, this electricity conundrum, which we've been speaking, would you think would be, if it was given immediate attention, would it as well also, I suppose, to use a metaphor, switch the lights on, which would be an aha moment whereby investors would say, these people are serious about turning the place around? What would be your other priority or priorities?
Yes, that's a good question. You know what, I think just in more, before I give you a straight answer, in a more general sense, you know, when we ask that kind of question in South Africa, we generally tend to think of big things that the state has to do, right? We need to deliver this project or that project or this mega project, etc. And some of that is good, but you know what we need to recognize is that we have a country, entire economy, and the best strategies are the ones that will leverage all of the economic actors in the economy, that will galvanize the entire economy. And it's that kind of thinking that we need to pursue. So, you know, I'm not really able to add anything new in terms of all the very good proposals that have been made around restoring economic confidence, taking very hard decisions around some structural reforms that need to be taking place in energy and telecoms, even in transport, etc. So, you know, what we need to do is we need to restore confidence so that the myriad of economic actors acting all independently get the signal and are happy to proceed with investing. I don't think we have a shortage of capital to invest. I think we have a shortage of confidence. And unfortunately, that does lie with our policymakers, those steps. I think there is some focus now, but the best thing we need to do right now is to take real steps and put people and processes in place to deliver on the reforms we need in telecoms and energy and transport, etc. Because that is those are the actions that I think will not only provide the infrastructure we need, but also the confidence that we need.
Because I suppose, as they say, talk is cheap, money buys the whiskey, and we're doing a lot of talking. Yeah. I'm to the end. This has been a very interesting conversation. I would imagine that people who've been listening to this, Javier, will listen to this, in many instances will be jumping up and down and wanting to slit their wrists, because it seems to me so obvious what you're saying. It seems to me, you know, a no-brainer, and yet we seem to be stuck in the mud. So I, for one, am certainly going to distribute this podcast to as many people who've got some influence as I possibly can muster. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. Thank you very, very much for giving us of your time and your expertise.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah.